Today I want to talk about both the sociology of psychoanalysis and the psychoanalysis of sociology. And to illustrate each of these, I have particular illustrations in mind. Let's talk about the psychoanalysis of sociology first. And although Freud was not really a sociologist by training, he certainly was a contributor to sociological theory. I mean, his work on religion, his work on civilization are contributions to sociological thought. And so let's focus on Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930. What's the key argument here? It is that human beings come into the world with an id, not much of an ego or a superego as yet. The id is composed of the drives, innate, unlearned, sexual and aggressive. Later he defines these as the life drive and the death drive, eros and thanatos. Therefore, a part of our nature is antisocial and asocial. Asocial in the sense that for Freud at the beginning, there is this state of primary narcissism, followed by secondary narcissism. We think we are at the center of everything. He refers to His Majesty, Lord of the Nursery, omnipotent, self-centered, narcissistic, and in that sense, asocial. Freud talks about how we need to overcome narcissism in favor of object love. This is a movement from narcissism towards the social. So asocial and also antisocial. We have the aggressive drive. We have the death drive. So we are self-centered and we are aggressive. And our drives, our sexual drive is also essentially antisocial. It's incestuous for Freud. The child is polymorphous perverse. So our antisocial innate sexuality and our antisocial aggression are incompatible with civilized order. Freud is saying, if you want civilization, people cannot be allowed to act naturally because people are naturally perverse, incestuous, aggressive. This asocial, antisocial core of human nature must be tamed in order for civilized order to be possible. There are a number of different ways of taming the drives. The predominant way is through repression, driving the drives down into the unconscious. Most people children and adolescents are, for the most part, unaware of their incestuous longings. There are some exceptions. Some adolescent boys are quite aware that they're hot for mommy, but most displace that onto other women. They repress it. It becomes part of the unconscious. Rage, anger, death wishes towards those who frustrate us, that's usually like incestuous sexuality. That's usually banned, repressed into the unconscious. Now, the problem with this is you get inevitably what Freud called the disguised return of the repressed. That which goes down comes back up, but in a different form. So it will come up as psychosomatic problems, headaches, pains and aches, or it will come up as other forms of psychoneurotic symptoms. The repressed returns in disguised forms. Therefore, that is neurotic form. So the price of civilization, according to Freud, is neurosis. In order to have civilization, if the person uses repression, you get the return of the repressed as neurosis. But there are a few possible exceptions, healthier ways of dealing with our antisocial core, healthier ways of inhibiting our antisocial core. One is through conscious suppression. I know I want to kill someone, but I will not allow myself to do this. I know I want to have sex with mommy, but I will not allow myself to move in that direction. I'm not going to lie to myself. I know about my incestuous feelings towards parents, siblings, but I'm not going to go there. This is a rare talent, to be able to be honest about one's dark side, while at the same time deciding to restrain oneself without lying to oneself. Rare talent. But that way you escape neurosis, because if you don't repress it, it doesn't come back in a neurotic form. You're not happy because you're walking around knowing you have all kinds of feelings and desires. You're not lying to yourself about them, but you're not going to gratify them. So you're walking around without gratification of what you know you desire. That's not exactly a happy person. It's a self-controlled person. It's a civilized person. But not too many people are capable of that level of self-control without sliding into self-deception. And the slide into self-deception sets up the disguised return, the neurotic symptoms. Okay, that's one healthier path. The other is sublimation. We may not, in sublimation, we're usually not aware of the fundamental desire or feeling, because we've managed to find a way to shift that desire away from an antisocial towards a pro-social outlet, so that the aggressive drive is shifted in the direction of hard work and ambition. Instead of killing people, we're competing with them, sometimes in physical sports. Instead of killing someone, we're checking someone into the boards in hockey. Or one could shift one's aggression potentially into a military career, or into becoming a cop, or some other disciplinarian, the authoritarian high school vice principal. I mean, there are many ways. Classically, one can think of shifting one's sadistic impulses. As a child, perhaps they were acted out in terms of tearing the wings off flies or the legs off spiders. And then it gets shifted into an interest in butterflies and collecting them, and then maybe into, I'm blocking on the name of that process, where you stuff animals, taxidermy. And next thing, you're going to medical school, and you're cutting up a cadaver, and you find you enjoy this cutting, and you decide to specialize in surgery. And now you are cutting flesh for pro-social reasons to remove the cancer. But what goes up can come down. If sublimation is a moving from the antisocial to the pro-social and moving up on a scale of values, in midlife you have a crisis, your wife leaves you, whatever, you're regressing. And the sublimation that was working begins perhaps to break down. And now as a surgeon, you were only really going in to take out a particular bit of cancer, but you decide to do the complete hysterectomy, or instead of removing a small tumor, you remove the entire breast, and then you're losing your medical license. Okay, sublimations can be built up, sublimations can break down. The problem is that very few people have the talent for sublimation, or have much talent for sublimation. The majority are going to be forced back on repression with the disguised return of the repressed. Not too many people have the strength of character to be able to manage conscious suppression, knowing but not acting out. So these paths, suppression, sublimation, are open to only the few. The majority will fall back on repression. There will be the disguised return of the repressed. There will then be neurosis. Therefore, Freud's argument is the price of civilization is neurosis. Instinctual renunciation is a price that we must pay, says Freud, in order to live in a civilized society. The higher the level of the civilization, the more there must be instinctual renunciation. So here we have a sociological theory, a theory of socialization and civilization, in which society requires us to renounce our instincts. We must surrender and sacrifice important bits of ourselves. In other words, society requires us to submit. Okay, so the psychoanalytic question is this really anything much more than a castration fantasy projected as social theory? Children, little boys certainly, commonly form an image of the father as a potential castrator. In the Oedipal phase, the little boy has sexual feelings and designs toward mommy, but mommy belongs to daddy. His anxiety is building up because daddy might retaliate if he knew. Guilt builds up because the little boy doesn't just hate daddy as a rival, he loves daddy as well. He's ambivalent if he's attained what Klein calls the depressive reparative position. He's dealing not with part objects but with whole objects. So he doesn't just hate daddy as a rival. He doesn't just have murderous rage in relation to his jealous and his envious feelings towards father, envious of father's potency, jealous of father's connection with mother. All of this aggression towards father leads to both guilt and anxiety. A lot of the boy's image of the father as a potential castrator is grounded in the boy's unconscious wish to castrate the father out of envy and out of jealousy. And he projects his own castrative wishes towards father. He projects them onto father and imagines father is out to castrate him. So now we have the castration fantasy. The authorities are going to castrate me unless I submit and renounce my instincts. Okay, this castration fantasy definitely exists. I see it in my practice all the time. I've seen it in myself, in my own analyses. I've seen it in so many male patients. So is this really a sociological theory that Freud has advanced, or is it a castration fantasy dressed up like a sociological theory? You know, it's interesting. Most sociologists have never really accepted this argument. Most sociologists are more aware of what society gives us than of what it threatens to take away from us. Many Freudians have been quite convinced by Freud's argument of civilization and its discontents, and some social theorists, Frankfurt School social theorists. But to a psychoanalyst, when I'm listening as a psychoanalyst, I'm not hearing social theory here. I'm hearing a castration fantasy disguised as social theory. So it's a confusion of society with the early mother who either feeds us or we starve, or an anal phase fantasy of society as a domineering parent who is trying to get us to control our bodies according to their wishes, not ours. Toilet training fantasy, phallic leading into the Oedipal fantasy. I don't entirely get to own my penis. Certainly there is, we are threatened with the possibility of castration. Those who undergo circumcision, kind of a mini castration, if they can take a bit, maybe if they can take a part, maybe they could take the whole thing. I better behave. I better internalize the law of the father. My penis is at stake. And I better let go of my sexual desires for mother because she seems to be already taken. Society as a castrator, a potential castrator that requires us to renounce important bits of ourselves as a price of socialization, of acculturation. Well, looks to me like a projection of a castration fantasy. Okay, that's the psychoanalysis of sociology. Let's turn now to the sociology of psychoanalysis. Turns out that, like any other intellectual tradition, any other theory, any other element of science, the psychoanalytic theory is constantly being influenced by the social conditions in which it arises, the social conditions that shape it. I'm referring now to the subfield of sociology called the sociology of knowledge. Theories come to be accepted not primarily because they may happen to be true. Many true theories are not socially accepted. They're not socially embraced. They don't catch on. The mere fact that it's true doesn't make it popular. The mere fact that it's true doesn't mean that it is embraced by major institutions and accepted widely. To be accepted widely, it doesn't have to be true. Many theories, well, we call them conspiracy theories and so on. Many theories are accepted as true that are not true. And there are many theories that are true that are not accepted. So it's a sociological question as to how come a theory comes to be widely accepted. Not that much to do, a little bit to do, but not that much to do with its truth content. Other factors are in play. And those other factors are always in play and influence the development of theory and the changing popularity of theories. There are trends and there are fads. I remember a great sociological work by Tiram Sorokin called Fads and Foibles in Sociological Theory. All theories are open to social influence, fads, trends, um, fashion. Okay, well, the example I'm going to use is how the great psychoanalytic theory of guilt and guilt evasion, I think this is one of Freud's greatest contributions, his understanding of the dynamics of guilt and the ways we evade guilt, the ways we defend against guilt. Freud's paper on character types met with in the course of psychoanalytic work, one of his greatest papers, in my opinion, where he talks about those who fear success. Why? Because they've got success confused in their minds with some Oedipal triumph over father, siblings, whatever. They fear success because if they have it, they fear they will then have to be punished for it because they've got success associated with some kind of crime in their minds. And then there are those who, Freud says, are wrecked by success because they understand it unconsciously as a triumph, a victory, a crime. So they let themselves have the success, and then they are wrecked by it. They fall into a deep depression. Guy's working on his PhD for years. He finally completes it. The examining committee take him over to the faculty club and raise a glass and celebrate. And he manages to get hit by a car on leaving the campus. He falls into a many months long depression. Wow, postpartum psychosis. Many women are successful. They actually produce a baby with 10 fingers and 10 toes, and then they get depressed. Now, there are many reasons. I don't mean to say that this is the only reason for a postpartum depression, but wrecked by success because the success is seen as triumphing over mother or sister or whomever. These are unconscious fantasies of success as a crime. People become self-sabotaging. People procrastinate. I personally procrastinated in the production of my PhD thesis because up until then there had only been one Dr. Carveth, and that was my father. My becoming Dr. Carveth felt like pushing him off the log, so I procrastinated and finally, the university more or less put a gun to my head and I had to produce it. So then I produced it, but I felt terribly guilty over dinner when my father was celebrating my success. I felt I just planted a dagger between his shoulder blades. Totally irrational fantasy, but that's the unconscious at work. So all of this work on self-sabotage, the dynamics of unconscious self-punishment, the great Carl Menninger, well, I guess it was Freud himself who first talked about guilt equivalence, and Menninger talked about guilt substitutes in his famous book, Man Against Himself, wonderful study of guilt substitutes. The guilt substitutes could be the migraine headaches. It could be various psychosomatic symptoms. Um, a guilt substitute might be uh, getting into a relationship with a punishing person who makes your life miserable, who makes you suffer because you have an unconscious need to suffer. So you find someone who will make you suffer. Um, one type of guilt evasion involves embracing one of the two types of guilt. Unfortunately, Freud did not make this distinction between persecutory guilt and reparative guilt. In persecutory guilt, I beat myself up. In reparative guilt, I stop with the self-punishment and I turn towards repair and reparation. So I beat someone up and he's bleeding in the corner and I'm flagellating myself. That's punitive guilt, persecutory guilt. It's of no use whatever to the person I've hurt. If I drop my cat o' nine tails and pick up my first aid kit and I start bandaging, I've moved into reparative guilt. But the odd thing is that there are many people who will continue with self-punishment and self-persecution for years rather than acknowledge their faults, their crimes, and their sins, experience contrition, and move into reparation. Persecutory guilt can serve as a defense against reparative guilt. Okay, I won't go on about these brilliant contributions by Freud and his early followers into the psychodynamics of guilt and guilt evasion. My point in this Sociology of Psychoanalysis is that beginning in the late 1950s, early 60s, psychoanalysts began to forget about all of this. Menninger wrote a book called Whatever Became of Sin. I wrote a paper called Whatever Became of the Superego. Analysts turned away from this in the late 50s, early 1960s. Why? Because our economy had shifted away from productive industrial capitalism towards consumer capitalism. In productive capitalism, we are urged by the society to save. In consumer capitalism, we're urged by society to spend. This shift into consumer capitalism produced the culture of narcissism. The last thing a narcissist wants to face is his guilt. And of course, this move into consumer capitalism led to the rise of neoliberalism or market fundamentalism. And this is all about deregulation of the society, of the economy. Deregulation. Let's get rid of the regulators, or let's at least let the regulators know that if they're kind to us while they're in government, as soon as they retire, they'll get a cushy job in the private sector and they'll be well rewarded for looking the other way. Society, the economy, moved towards deregulation. It turned against regulators. Well, what are the regulators in the psyche? The superego and the conscience. So the attention of psychoanalysts turned away from the regulators and turned away from regulation. And we went heavily into a victim psychology. We became obsessed with trauma and psychopathology as a reaction to trauma. Now, I'm not downplaying the reality of trauma. It exists. It's important. But it is not the sole source of psychopathology. There's a great deal of psychopathology that is not about trauma. It's about the damn human condition, which is painful. We want people we can't have. We want things we can't have. We get frustrated because we can't have our cake and eat it too. And we get angry because our mother is faithless. She goes and has sex with someone who isn't me, and she then brings home a goddamn brother or a sister. I'm no longer little Lord Fauntleroy, the center of the world. There's this little competitor I have to put up with. Juliet Mitchell says, where there are siblings, murder is in the air. Okay, the human situation is frustrating, and frustration generates aggression. And a great deal of the aggression cannot be vented at those who frustrate us, because they'll be angry, they'll reject us further. We can't risk letting them see the anger. Well, what are we going to do with it? We bottle it up. We turn it on ourselves. It backs up all over us like a toilet. Our aggression, our bottled up aggression, well, this is the superego. The superego is aggression turned away from the others back onto us. And now we're beating ourselves up. We're punishing ourselves. But psychoanalysts looked away from this. Psychopathology was a reaction to not good enough mothers, absent or authoritarian fathers. The dynamics of guilt and self-punishment were lost sight of. It's like analysts seem to forget that even where there really is serious trauma, they kind of lost sight of the fact that trauma generates rage. Trauma and frustration generate anger and rage, and that gets turned on the self. And a great deal of the pathology that results from trauma results from the rage that flows from trauma, that follows from trauma. But this all was lost sight of. So here we have the shift of the late capitalist economy towards consumer capitalism, leading on to neoliberal deregulation. This hostility to regulation in the economy somehow affected psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysts turned away from the psychic regulators. And a whole new conception of pathology as a reaction to trauma emerges and becomes dominant. Never completely. There always have been some old-fashioned Freudians and Kleinians who could still see the relevance of the older psychology of guilt. But all of those self-psychologists and so many of those so-called relational and intersubjective analysts turned away from the psychology of guilt. I think a lot of them had authoritarian parents, and maybe they'd had authoritarian analysts, and in reacting against authority, they lost touch entirely with the psychology of guilt and the dynamics of guilt and self-punishment. Okay, sociology. What catches on in psychoanalysis? What catches on in psychoanalysis has a lot to do with the surrounding society. Psychoanalysis is not immune from the social surround any more than any other theory is. Okay, the psychoanalysis of sociology. Some sociological theories are products of unconscious fantasies. And the sociology of psychoanalysis. Some psychoanalytic theories catch on and become fashionable, and people turn away from others due to social factors like the rise of neoliberalism and the attack on regulation. Okay.